Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0. It is not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributor to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. In the 22nd episode of the series, we take a look at 2 similar all-time Hall of Fame centers who both averaged 20 and 10 for their career, but neither had much playoff success or won any championships. Bob Lanier is known as the Detroit Pistons and Milwaukee Bucks legend who intimidated with his size and presence and was a skilled post player with a variety of hook shots and jumpers, while Walt Bellamy terrorized defenders with his agility and athleticism, and played for a gauntlet of different teams including the Baltimore Bullets, New York Knicks, and Atlanta Hawks. Both of these centers were perennial all-stars, but who had the better career? Let's find out. In the scoring category, both players were difficult to stop down low as Lanier had a variety of moves in the post and Bellamy with pure strength and athleticism. Both Bellamy and Lanier averaged 20.1 points per game for their careers, while Lanier peaked at 25.7 points per game in 1972, and Bellamy peaked at a ridiculous 31.6 points per game in 1962 when he was just a rookie. Both players dropped in the playoffs, with Lanier averaging 18.6 points per game and Bellamy averaging 18.5 points per game, with the reason being that both players only had more playoff success later in their careers. However, Lanier peaked at a higher 28 points per game in the 1977 playoffs, while Bellamy peaked at only 20.9 points per game in the 1965 playoffs. For this category, it's pretty close and hard to say who's better, Bellamy peaked higher in the regular season and peaked earlier, while Lanier peaked higher in the playoffs and was a bit more consistent. Both ended up having around the same career averages, so I'll just have to score this category as a tie. In the rebounding category, both players were fantastic rebounders, with Lanier averaging 10.1 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at 14.9 rebounds per game in 1973, and 9.6 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at a Dave Cowens-like 16.7 rebounds per game in 1977. But while Lanier was a solid rebounder, Bellamy was more athletic, averaging an incredible 13.7 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at a Wilt Chamberlain-like 19 rebounds per game in 1962, and 14.8 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at 16.5 rebounds per game in 1967. Although their playoffs peak was similar, and both players stood at the same height of 6'11", Bellamy consistently averaged higher numbers for longer, and thus this category will go to him. In the passing category, both players were typical low-post players who weren't the primary distributors for their teams. Bellamy had very typical numbers for his position, averaging 2.4 assists per game for his career, peaking at 3.2 per game in 1972, and 3 per game in the playoffs, peaking at 3.9 per game in 1970. However, Lanier has slightly above average numbers, averaging 3.1 assists per game for his career, peaking at 4.6 per game in 1975, and 3.5 per game in the playoffs, peaking at a surprising 6.5 assists per game in 1975. Lanier had better numbers across the board, and thus this category will go to him. In the efficiency category, both players were quite efficient and put up above average true shooting percentage, win shares per 48, and PER numbers. Both had an efficient post game and routinely got excellent looks at the basket. However, Lanier just slightly edges out with Bellamy's solid efficiency with even better numbers, and thus I'll give this category to him. In the defense category, neither player had any all-defensive selections, but then again, they are competing in an era with Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Nate Thurmond, Willis Reed, Weston Seld, and Dave Cowens, so there's only so many defensive awards to go around. However, just judging from the defensive win shares and defensive box plus-minus, Lanier easily takes this one as he has quite a large margin on Bellamy here. In the awards category, neither player had many accolades outside of all-star appearances. Championships eluded both players, despite Bellamy playing with legends such as Gus Johnson and Bailey Howell on the Baltimore Bullets, Willis Reed and Walt Frazier on the New York Knicks, and Pistol Pete Maravich and Lou Hudson on the Atlanta Hawks. Bob Lanier played with Dave Bing on the Detroit Pistons, and Marcus Johnson and Sidney Moncrief later in his career on the Milwaukee Bucks. So while both of these big men were Hall of Famers, neither of them impacted their team the way a Shaq or Hakeem or Moses would. In addition, they have no All-NBA selections due to the fierce competition in the center position during the 1960s and 1970s. Since all I have to go on is All-Star appearances, I'll give this one to Lanier as he has double the All-Star appearances of Bellamy. So when all the categories are summed up, Bellamy takes the rebounding category while Lanier takes the passing, efficiency, defense, and awards categories, with scoring being a tie, giving Lanier the win. Bob Lanier is perhaps only remembered by the old-timers as some Pistons and Bucks fans now, but he had a long and productive career where he was always a Hall of Fame level player, albeit not a transcendent first-ballot Hall of Fame type player. And the same story goes for Walt Bellamy, an even more forgotten player who put up the eye-popping numbers in his prime, was shuffled around many different teams, but like Lanier, not finding much playoff success and never being transcendent enough to beat out the Kareems and Wilts of the NBA. However, I hope I shone some light on these two forgotten Hall of Fame centers from the 1960s and 1970s, who were always very good but never great enough for people to mention them in today's conversations. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.